Thank you for joining this webinar. Correspondence analysis is my go-to technique when I've got a large table of data and I want to quickly understand and communicate what it means. If you've never done it before, at the end of this webinar, you should have the confidence and the skills to do correspondence analysis entirely on your own. If you've done it before, I'm hopefully going to show you some new tricks and techniques that you haven't seen. As always, I'm going to be demonstrating in Displayer as it's designed for interactive presentations, but I'll also show you how to do the things in Q as well. If you have any questions, please type them into the questions field in GoToWebinar, and I'll get through to them at the end. Today, I'm going to show you when and how to use correspondence analysis, how to correctly interpret it, normalization and scaling, rotation, the various variants of correspondence analysis, and some ideas on the best ways to visualize the data. We've got an ebook on the topic, which I'll link to a bit later as well. But let's do some examples. Here's a table of data. What can you see? You've got 5 seconds. It's kind of a bit overpowering, isn't it? It's like, oh, okay, did you find anything? And this is what correspondence analysis is for. When we use correspondence analysis, the patterns in the data kind of jump out at us. We can see here that Opel and Volkswagen Golf are popular. Toyota Prius is seen as being green, Mazda MX-5 and BMW are seen as being sporty. They jump to the page because the visualization is designed for our brains to process really quickly. How do we do this in Q for all the Q users out there? Let me drag it onto the screen. So here's Q. For those of you that are not familiar with Q, Q's the first bit of software we wrote. It was launched way back in 2007. So it precedes Displayer. I've got a table. If I want to create correspondence analysis, I click Create, go into the dimension reduction. There are all of these options. The one I would recommend you choose most of the time is called Correspondence Analysis of a Table, which is the same name as what we had in Displayer. And I click my input data, so I'm choosing that table above. All the other aspects of the inputs are exactly the same as Displayer, and the options all look the same, just formatted a little bit differently. And we get the visualization. So that is Q. Here is a much bigger table. 15 rows. Not 15, 42 rows for different brands. 15 attributes columns. It's really too big. How long would it take you to figure out what it means? We want to use correspondence analysis. If you're new to Displayer, you can just type things in and the little yellow will alert us to where we can find options. So I'm going to go visualization, dimension reduction, and most of the time, as I mentioned, we'll choose correspondence analysis of the table. And that massive grid gets compressed into a visualization, and we can quite quickly see patterns. We can see that the shoe and the jeans brands are sitting up here as outdoorsy and tough. Calvin Klein, American Express, Lexus, and Mercedes are down here as being upper class. Kmart, Cocoa Pops, down to earth. It's a very efficient way to find the story in data. There is one thing that you need to know to interpret these things correctly. It's simple, but it's not obvious, and you are going to know it soon. We're going to start with a really simple example of a crosstab. And as a little thought exercise, we're going to work through what patterns can we see in this crosstab. So this is what I can see. I can see that Diet Pepsi is strongly associated with 50 or more. Now, some people go 5% is a small number, sure, but it's a lot larger than 0. Even 5% versus 2%, 5% is more than double 2%. So it is actually a strong pattern, even if the Diet Pepsi shares are really small. We can see that Diet Coke is really weak with the 18 to 24s. Pepsi is strong with the 25 to 29s. Coke is actually strong in all of the age brackets. And lastly, we can see that Coke's particularly strong with the 18 to 24s. So that's what I see from this thing. It's my summary. Now, as an experienced researcher, I can read the table pretty easily. I'm sure all of you can as well. But it's useful to work through a simple example. So before I was switching tables into visualizations, now I'm going to insert a visualization. And I will choose dimension reduction again, correspondence analysis of a table. And because I already had that table selected, that data will be pushed into the visualization. Now, before we focus on how to read it correctly, I'm going to tell you the mistake to avoid. The rookie mistake is to focus on things being close together. Most people who aren't trained to read correspondence analysis correctly, they'll look at something like this and they'll go, aha, Coke and 18 to 24 are next to each other. That's the strongest pattern. No, it's not the strongest pattern. It's actually one of the weaker patterns. The strongest pattern is that Diet Pepsi is closely correlated with 50 or more. Another strong pattern is that the 18 to 24 is negatively correlated with Diet Coke. And we'll soon go through how we read that. So what are the rules? Rule 1. The closer the row labels of the table are together, the more similar they are. And in this case, our row labels are our brands. And so we can say that the two most similar brands in terms of their age profiles are Diet Coke and Coke Zero. The closer the column labels, the more similar they are. So in this case, our column labels are ages. So we can say that 50 or more people are marginally more similar to 25 to 49s than the 18 to 24s in terms of their brand preferences. Now, if we want to find the relationship between a brand and their age, or between a row and a column, the way we do it is we draw lines from where the points for representing the brand are to the middle or the origin of the visualization. Then we do the same thing for the age. And if that angle is really small, where these two lines intersect, it tells us the two things are correlated. So Diet Pepsi and 50 or more are correlated. The second thing we take into account is the distance or the length of these particular lines. The longer the lines, the stronger the correlation. Now, here we've got a long line and a short line. How do we work out the combined strength? We simply multiply the two together. And so the multiplication of these two distances is quite a big number. And so we say that combining with the fact that it's a small angle, there's a very strong correlation between Diet Pepsi and 50 or more, even though they're a long way apart. For those of you that love a formula, this is the precise way of doing it. You'll have to go back to your high school maths and do cosine or cos. But I always find just the intuitive explanation that I gave is more than adequate. So there's a strong relationship between 50 or more and Diet Pepsi. There's a very strong negative relationship between Diet Coke and 18 to 24. And we can see this because the angle is obtuse. It's a very large angle, it's almost flat. That tells us negative correlation, and they're both quite a long way from the center of the map, which tells us again that it's a strong pattern. If we look at Pepsi to 25 to 49, we can see that there's a moderate relationship. So the angle is not as sharp or acute as what we had before, and the points are not as far from the center, which is why we're saying it's a moderate relationship. And going back to the original one we talked about of Coke and 18 to 24, it's a very small angle, it's acute, suggesting they're correlated. They're not particularly far from the middle of the map, which is why we say it's a moderate rather than a particularly strong relationship. Here we have the original conclusions that I typed in a bit earlier, and we have the conclusions that I just drew from the correct interpretation of the map. And what you'll notice is that they're almost identical. I say almost identical because one thing is different, which is that this conclusion that Coke is the most popular brand with all of the age groups isn't visible on the map. Let's emphasize it. Um, it's not visible on the map. Why is it not visible on the map? Well, you might go, well, maybe we should redraw the map so that it's obvious that Coke is close to everything else. But to do that would mean the only way we could achieve that is we could move all of the age groups here. And so it's the nature of a correspondence analysis that it will only ever show us relativities. And we'll come back to how we address that issue a little bit later. The next thing to keep in mind is that the further something is from the middle of the map, the more strong the information is about it. And so Diet Pepsi, it's down here, it's telling us we can learn a lot about Diet Pepsi from the map. Coke, relatively close to the center, we can learn less about Coke from the map. This next point's really profound, but it's a little bit hard on the brain. So I'll start you with an analogy. Correspondence analysis maps present a particular view of the data. This is just like drawing a face. Depending on the point of view, conclusions will change. Note how here, this is the distance from the eye to the nose is different when the head's tilted back, is different from profile. So which way we look at a face shows a different distance between the eye and the nose. Furthermore, if we look at the mugshot at the top left, we can't even see the hairstyle shown down here. This is kind of obvious, right? Where we look at a person reveals different things. Less obvious though is it's the same thing with any display of data. One of the ways that we can address this issue is to rearrange things. So if we take, for example, the globe, right? This globe is obviously defective. It doesn't show Australia. Um, Here it's been flattened out. I think it's called the Mercator map or something. It's been flattened out so that you can see Australia. So what's happened, being a bit technical, we've gone from 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. We've flattened it out, and in flattening it out, we are actually distorting the data. Now, in this particular map here, it shows us that the distance between Sydney, where I'm based in Australia, and London is about twice as far as the distance between Sydney and Los Angeles. And based on flight times, that's about right. It takes me 13 hours to fly to LA. It takes me 26 hours to fly to London. Okay, so the map seems accurate. But this map here is an American-centric map. Makes sense to an American. If we're a European, the following map is more useful. It's got Europe in the middle of the map, but notice the conclusions change. On this map, London appears much closer to Sydney than LA, which is clearly misleading, right? And so just as with the faces, the conclusion that you get when you look at the data changes on which perspective you've got. You have the same problem even with a map of the world. What's going on here is we're compressing information, and this is leading to a loss of information. A 3D globe, when shown as 2D, one dimension is lost, and conclusions become misleading. Going back to our brand personality table with 42 brands and 15 attributes, that's technically 15 dimensions of data, which are compressed to 2D, so quite a lot of information will be lost. There will be more distortions, potentially, than we get in the geographic example. Correspondence analysis maps typically show us how much information is expressed in the map. So this very busy map here, showing us all of the brands by attributes in that big table. The horizontal coordinate explains 34.4% of the information. The vertical 22.2. If we add them, this map explains 56.6 or 57% of all of the data, which means we've lost 43% of the information. That is, 43% of the patterns evident in the massive table aren't seeable in this visualization. It doesn't mean the visualization is broken. It just means it's summarizing the strongest features and not showing some information, just as we saw with the geographic maps. The implication of this is you always want to see what you can learn from the map, but then go back to the raw data and check it. If you use the default correspondence analysis that I've showed you, you get the best overall summary of the data. But there are some tweaks you can do that make correspondence analysis actually better in certain situations. And two of them relate to normalization and scaling. Now, all correspondence analyses make technical assumptions about how data is normalized and scaled. In Q and displayer, this is shown by default as something called a principal normalization. And so if you go back and look at these maps here, you can see it says at the bottom principal, well, this one says row principal scaled. As we're about to see shortly, the default one in displayer shows principal, but we're going to play with that. Now, when we use the principal normalization, it's designed so that the distance between the different row labels is as accurate as possible. The distance between the column labels is as accurate as possible, but the relationship between rows and columns is a little less accurate. That's a trade-off that's been made. If we use something called row principal, it guarantees us that the distance between the rows is as accurate as possible to show in 2 dimensions. The relationships between the rows and columns is as accurate as possible, but the distance between the columns is less accurate. So we've got a bit of a trade-off. This map can be very hard to read, which is why the row principal scaled version exists. But let's do all of that in practice. So here's the default principal normalization. As I said, it optimally shows the relationships between each of the attributes and between each of the brands, but it's not quite as good at showing the relationships between brand and attributes. But when we're looking at brand data, we're principally interested in the brand information. And so we're going to change the normalization to be row principal. And this guarantees that the position of the brands is optimal and the relationships between the brand attributes is optimal. But we've got an almighty mess because everything is in the middle. And that's why we need this option called row principal scaled. And now we have the best visualization for displaying the relationship between the brands to the attributes and the brands to each other. The next topic is rotation. As I mentioned in the earlier example of the face, the distance between the eye and the nose is a function of the view that we take. When we rotate the face, we learn different things about the data. They're all true, they're just different perspectives. In much the same way, we can rotate correspondence analysis to make it represent a particular view of the data more accurately. So let's look at this visualization that we looked at before. What does it tell us about Mini Cooper? Now, if you've ignored much of what I've said before, you'll think, Mini Cooper is all about city. But really, what it's telling us is there does seem to be a weak correlation between Mini Cooper and city, but Mini Cooper is relatively close to the center of the map, so we're not learning a massive amount about Mini Cooper. So what we can do to fix that problem is we can rotate it. Now, before we rotate it, I want you to notice something, or a couple of things. The first thing is the map at the moment is pretty good for showing all of the information. Maybe we want to change it to row principal to better show the information about the brands, as we talked about before. We can also see that this map here, though, again, it's still got this issue with Mini Cooper being relatively close to the center, and we've got this dimension reduction or loss information. So if we add together, we're seeing on this map, 30% of the variance is described horizontally, 23% is described vertically. That adds up to, I think, can I do this in my head? 53%. So we've lost 47% of the information. I'm now going to make this principally about Mini Cooper. So I'm going to tell it to redraw, focusing on Mini Cooper by putting it into the focus box. It's moved Mini Cooper further from the middle of the map. And so now we've got really good evidence. There's actually a very strong relationship between Mini Cooper and city. And this is because we've now drawn this map to just tell the best story about Mini Cooper. But in doing this, we have lost some information. So before we were explaining 53% of the variance in the data. Now we're explaining 18 plus 28, which is 46% of the information. So the map is less accurate overall. So again, there's a trade-off. Another thing to note here is the dimensions. Normally, when we look at correspondence analysis, the horizontal dimension shown at the bottom explains more variance than the vertical dimension, but that hasn't happened here. We're seeing the vertical dimension is showing more information than the horizontal. Now, some people want to describe to clients and go, oh, the dimension one is more less important than dimension 2, you don't need to ever point that out with a properly drawn correspondence analysis map. It's obvious. If you look at this thing, we do have more vertical variation, and that's all this number is showing us. We've got relatively less horizontal variation, and you can see that yourself, the more clustered together. There are a number of different variants of correspondence analysis. So far, everything I've shown you is just called correspondence analysis, or sometimes traditional correspondence analysis. 99% of the time, what I've shown you is the best technique. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can ignore what I'm about to show you and tune back in when I get to data visualization. Here we have a square table. It's called square because it's got the same number of rows of columns and the labels in the rows and the columns are the same. Now this one is showing us brand switching information. It's showing us that 401 people purchased cornflakes week 1 and the next time they purchased it again. 194 people who had purchased cornflakes went on to purchase Weetabix. Now if we want to visualize this, we click it, select it, we go correspondence analysis of a table, draw that. Maybe I'll resize that. Now you'll immediately see we've got a bit of a problem here, which is that each brand appears twice because they appear plotting their row and the column. Not such a helpful map. So we're going to switch this to correspondence analysis of a square table. It uses a slightly different algorithm, but doesn't make much of a difference in this case here. And we've now got each label once. So that's an improvement. A lot of people hear about this thing called multiple correspondence analysis, and they think it must be multiple times more useful than traditional correspondence analysis. And there's a reason that that's a valid conclusion to draw, which is in other areas of statistics, that's true. Multiple regression is more useful than simple regression. But with correspondence analysis, the opposite. Multiple correspondence analysis is virtually never useful or as useful as traditional correspondence analysis. But let me show you how it works anyway. So let's say I'm wanting to understand preferred cola. I'm now selecting the raw variable itself. So multiple correspondence analysis, key distinction is it operates on the raw data rather than the table. So I choose preferred cola and I want to look at that by age and gender. So I've selected that data. Now I'll choose to visualize it using multiple correspondence analysis. Now, you may think this is better because it's got the word multiple. You may think this is better because it's now looking at 3 things, age, gender, and preferred color. So it seems a richer analysis. I get all that. It's just wrong. Anyway, let me prove to you it's wrong rather than you having to take my word for it. Here, with this multiple correspondence analysis, and I would stress it's interpreted the same way as traditional correspondence analysis, except we can't do the row normalization, another problem. With this, it's explaining 43 plus 22%, so it's explaining 65% of the variance in the data. How do we do this same analysis with traditional correspondence analysis? Well, we do it by building up a crosstab. So I'm going to take preferred cola. I'm going to crosstab it by age. And then I'm going to also add gender onto this one here in a banner. And so now I've got a crosstab of preferred color by age and gender. I'm going to create my traditional correspondence analysis of a table visualization. And so note here that all the examples before it only had 2 things, brand and attributes. Here I've got 3 things, brand, age, and gender, and I can do that just by creating a table, and they all appear as a visualization. But here's the magic. Remember before this visualization, the multiple correspondence was only explaining 65% of the data. When I built up the table this way, I explained 71 plus 21, so 92% of the information. So it's statistically a vastly superior visualization. As I said, it's almost always better to create a crosstab and use traditional correspondence than to use multiple correspondence analysis. This isn't a coincidence what I've shown you, it's always true. Jumping forward to visualization. If your goal is just to interpret the data, then the visualizations that I've shown you do the job. But if you want to do something a bit cooler and more interesting, you can do that as well. Back in my days as a researcher, I had a couple of colleagues who became clients who really loved complex outputs. I'd just like to say hello to Toby and Ian if you're on this, which you're probably not. Um, this one was particularly done for Ian. He loved three-dimensional correspondence analysis. You can do it. If you want to visualize it, here it is. To read it, you've got to rotate stuff. I don't find it useful myself, but you can do it. What I do like to do is to replace the row labels of brands with pictures of the brands or cans in the case of the soft drink market or logos. I think that's a really great thing to do. And you can build on this further. This is a cool visualization that my colleague Claudia set up. So here she's done the correspondence analysis of the vending machine. It doesn't show the origin super directly, maybe a triumph of style over substance, but you can infer where the origin is based on these 0 points shown on the axes. Now, this is interactive in a really nice way, which is, I'll just emphasize, we can see that when we're looking at the young people who are currently filtered, they see these brands as being about enjoyment of life, these energy brands. If we instead filter the data to look at the older people, we see the brand's positionings are very similar, but the attribute enjoys life has moved down and is now sitting with these more traditional collar brands. Here's another cool example. Again, it's interactive. Here we're showing the size of the attributes or the extent to which the attributes distinguish between brands based on bubbles. And here we've done that showing the size of the brands based on the bubbles. And this solves that issue we had a little bit earlier. Remember we saw this thing that Coca-Cola was strongest in all age groups and the correspondence analysis couldn't show us that, but we can show it by showing Coca-Cola has the biggest brand. It kind of gives us a bit more of an understanding of that. And you'll tend to see the bigger brands are close to the center of the map. Now, some people believe their clients aren't smart enough to do that whole thing about calculating angles and looking at the distance of things. There is a special visualization if you have such a client. We change the visualization from correspondence of a table to a moon plot. And the moon plot has a much simpler interpretation. We can just look at whether things are close together and take into account the size of the font. So this very clearly tells us that the strongest pattern in this visualization is that Fanta is closest for kids and fun, and for kids and fun are really strong discriminators. Sadly, people who think the clients are dumb also think moon plots are dumb, which is a bit of a challenge. Anyway, we have an ebook you can download from our website. We will send you a recording of the webinar. What questions you've got? If you've got any questions, please type them into the questions field in GoToWebinar. And the first question I've got is, can we show significance on these visualizations? And you actually can. So you can technically, on any one of the visualizations, there's a technical way of doing it where you could go and you can draw circles indicating the uncertainty about things. I personally think it's a horrible idea. And people have invented all this kind of complicated maths, but it's a horrible idea. What you should instead do is, in my view, you should always look at the raw data. And if it's got significance patterns you want to do, you could maybe do significance tests here. If that was what you're trying to do, but you do them on the raw data, you shouldn't do them on the map. And the reason you shouldn't do them on the map is the map has already got known distortions. So you're doing significance tests of distorted data. And so this is this point I was making before. We have information loss on the data, so you should always check the raw data. Neil, hello. Neil, I feel it's forever since we've caught up. Neil says, I love correspondence, but sometimes researchers do not get it. So Neil's got these dumb clients. And it is true, sometimes researchers don't get it. It's pretty rare though if you explain it. Maybe make them watch my webinar. How do you feel this data should be presented? Well, I feel that the data should be presented in a correspondence analysis and the client should be trained. If you don't feel the client's up for that, as I said, the moon plot is the way to go. Israel, hello Israel, he says, is there any cutoff and dimension percent being represented not using correspondence analysis map? No, there's not. I understand the intuition of the question, right? The intuition of the question really comes from techniques like principal components analysis or factor analysis. And if you had something like factor analysis, we might say to ourselves, We only want to show the data if, say, it explains 60% or more of the variance in the data. But I think that's the wrong way to think about correspondence analysis. I think it's a bit of a false analogy. Let's go back to this original big brand personality thing. And let's say we had some arbitrary rule. We want to explain 60% of the variation in the data. It would mean we wouldn't show this correspondence analysis, but it misses the point. The point is the table before was huge. It had 42 rows and 15 attributes. Of course, we're going to lose a lot of information. We should be okay with that. We've just got to check that the conclusions are still in the data. And let me give you the kind of the more relevant analogy. When we have a large questionnaire with 100 questions in it, and we've got thousands of respondents, we only show a tiny fraction of that information in the report. It's the stuff that we've curated and decided was interesting for our stakeholder. Correspondence analysis is just doing the same thing. It is showing you the strongest patterns. It just means there's lots of other patterns that don't get shown. And that's all of the questions that I've got. For all of you clients out there, thank you so much for being a client. If you're not a client, well, maybe you've seen something that means you might want to buy, and you could just go to the displayer website, book a demo, and we could show you. We could take a free trial and buy it then. Anyway, thanks everybody. Have a great day. Bye now.